our team that's sitting in the back tonight. So we'd like to welcome you all. Welcome everyone who's tuning in online on YouTube. This talk will be available there, recorded and posted later today if you don't catch it live. So stay tuned and check out the visual arts page and all the content that we have up on YouTube. You can review past exhibitions. We do a lot of artist talks, lectures, and also artist interviews, so check it out. But tonight I'd really like to welcome Joel Nalven, who will be talking about who is the AI artist who is the artist in the AI world, actually, is the title of the lecture tonight. And we're going to be talking about different issues surrounding the topic of artificial intelligence, AI, but also originality, authorship, copyright value when we're talking about artists and using AI tools to create. So with that, I'd like to introduce Joe Nalven, who holds a Ph.D. in cultural anthropology. He was co-director of San Diego State's Institute for Regional Studies of the Californias, and is a research associate at the Institute of Chicano Studies here in Barrio Logan. Joe has co-authored a book on digital art in 2005 and has wrote numerous art blogs for the San Diego Union Tribune, as well as curated exhibitions and organized many art shows here in San Diego. So with that, let's welcome Joe tonight. Thank you, Joe, for being here.
Thank you, Bonnie. The title could have been, Who Am I in the AI world? Because I'm also finding my way through this new technology. So I'll be going back and forth between what others are doing in the general world as well as what I'm doing. To begin with, where does it fit in my own development as an artist? I could start back in high school. I took 3.5 years of drafting, which gave me a very geometric view of the world, and I've been fighting that geometry ever since. I went on and when I was in Peace Corps, and then later when I did my doctoral field work, I did ethnographic photography, very interested in terms of how people live their lives, and it would help me understand what it was that I was seeing, which is one of the issues about what artists do. What are they seeing about the world and projecting about the world? I also wanted to mention that I began with cut and paste collage work. Then I incorporated my photography and then went on to mixed media, and I've used fused glass as well, and of course the all-powerful Photoshop editing tool. Then AI came on the scene, and I paid attention to it. And that's only a little bit more than a year ago for me, but it's been decades in the development. So it's a question of when we enter into the stream of this new technology. I also wanted to mention in terms of my approach to art, I do both inductive approach. I begin with something that I'm not quite sure what it is and then work my way through it until I have something that makes sense as an art piece. I've also done deductive art where I know what it is I would like to do and then look around for the different elements to fit into that vision. So some artists prefer one or the other, but it's good to acknowledge that that different approach as we look at this tool set. I'd like to mention briefly the book that I co-authored, The Practice and Vision of Digital Art. Here we gave 3 images to 17 different artists. One of the human environment, a person, one of the built environment of a building, and the other of a landscape. It was a picture out of the Grand Canyon. So you take those 3 identical images and give it to 17 digital artists, and they come up with 17 different variations. Their own vision with their own different tool set and their flow, and we asked them to document that as they went along. So part of the discussion is about technique and tool sets, as well as that's the how of doing art, the how of digital art, and then there's the why, the vision that we bring to it. about this image that we're looking up here on the screen. This is a text prompt image. I asked for two women with one above the other, and I think I did it in, I used various platforms. I think it was in DALL-E 2, but it may have been some other platform. And this was one of the variations that came up. So the question that we'll ask later on is that, well, who is really the artist, myself or the platform, the generative AI model? But with one person above the other or the side of the other, you'll look at that and you'll see in the orange is really a glow of another woman, which became faded out. So that gets into, well, do I leave that or do I keep that? So again, there are some aesthetic decisions that I was making in creating this image. The question is it enough to warrant, say, copyright or some kind of authenticity? So that is part of the dialogue that we'll have today. And then what more could we do to inject more of the human element of human authorship? Okay, so here we have a telephone switchboard. Many of the younger generation have no clue what that technology was, but I actually worked part-time when I went to Columbia University on the switchboard. There'd be an incoming call with one spaghetti wire, and then I would connect it to an extension with the other spaghetti wire. I got so good that they allowed me to work on the line with the rest of the women. It was a gender-defined occupation there. So what happened? When Centrex came in, there was an article in Time magazine that 400,000 switchboard operators lost their jobs. And I always ask my students, well, is it worth it? Would you rather keep the switchboard and have these workers continue working, or move on into Centrex? We now have moved on to smartphones. Imagine the thousands of workers who may have lost their jobs, but then new workers have gotten other jobs. So there is a cost to progress that we label. And all of our technology that we've bought into has those trade-offs and those costs. AI is no different from any other tool set, except that the way in which the costs are distributed across society fall unevenly compared to other technologies. Okay, so here are some examples that I've been using with generative AI. I was in a conference giving a talk on materials sciences, and I said, well, maybe I can create a new nanoparticle. It was all about nanoparticles, and so I said, well, let me create a virus, kaleidoscopic virus nanoparticle. I have no idea how this relates to reality, but it looks really cool. So that's one thing that I envisioned, or I was very happy with. Well, what about if I could expand the canvas, which is what I did in Photoshop. They have a particular tool called generative fill. So I expanded the canvas here, it's wider, and then I said, well, let me have a antivirus to contain the kaleidoscopic virus nanoparticle. And so it created these antiviruses. Again, it's a creative process that we can use to test our concepts. All of our words are loaded with different meanings, metaphors, tropes, and here we have these generative models. Some of them are focused on text, large language models, others focused on health issues, others focused on design of buildings or weaponry, and some in art, making imagery. So it has this kind of surprise factor to it, which I value quite a bit, regardless of whether other value it has. This kind of interplay of having a partner in creativity is very nice. It's my computer right there. I don't have to call up my friend and say, what do you think about such and such? Okay, so how about create a variant of the image? So there is a self-portrait image, which is kind of so-so, but I use my smartphone for that. And I said, well, let me do a variant of the selfie. And here I moved into stable diffusion. And that variant, now I'm not very happy with it. And I think that's important to recognize that a lot of the results that we get if we're playing with are not quote unquote good results, but it's part of a process that we're playing with it. What about moving on from just doing a variant into doing a hybrid image? So here, in number 4, I was in the process of creating a hybrid image. So in Stable Diffusion, you can take your image, and they have one particular algorithm called loopback, and it gives you a spread of a number of different iterations of that particular image. And so here's one I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. They also have another algorithm called upscale, and there it will keep the exact same structure of your image, and it goes out and pulls in all this crud, I don't know what other word, that other people's images. Now, I don't know if anybody could claim that I've infringed on their image, because it's in bits and pieces that they pull it and they stick it onto my original image. So I took those two and I went back, and I probably took a third or fourth one, and went back into Photoshop and then layered one on top of the other. And here you can use a blending or a montage mode of different degrees of transparency, using different blend modes to integrate and finally come up with something that makes sense as an artist. So this last one, this hybrid selfie, I was actually kind of pleased with, and I've had it printed, and maybe I'll show it in some show. The point is that you can move from the original selfie into this hybrid image, and at this point, I believe we're crossing over from kind of a minimal originality with the text prompt into something that has a lot more human authorship or claim for human authorship on these hybrid approach. So again, I think it's important to recognize that there is not just simply one generative AI approach. There is a spectrum, and where are we on that spectrum is an ongoing question. Okay, so let's, well, before we do that, I want to go back a second. On talking about hybrid, there's an artist named David Salle. He's a painter, and the New York Times did an extensive article on him where he had the help of 2 technologists that trained their model on his own prior images. Then he wanted to see if it could generate new images of David Salle. And they did that, and it was kind of interesting. Several months later, he's at the Whitney Museum on a panel discussion with other artists using AI. And one of the things that he said in his presentation was that when he looked at the output of that original trained set of data, it was really uninspiring. It lacked energy. It was his old work from 20 years earlier. So what did he do? He printed out a canvas, and then he painted on top of that, and then created a hybrid painting. It is the same thing what he's doing. What I'm doing is in terms of how do you then play with this output and not just simply use it in a static way or an endpoint that is, I would say, is unsatisfactory, that it really needs a lot more interrogation, a lot more playing with. Okay, that's my premise. Other artists may see it in a different way. Okay, another fascination I've had is since 1964, when I took a class on the act of creation. It was based on the book by Arthur Koestler, and I will talk a little bit more about him. And to me, it seemed to be that if you have a single line, black line on a white canvas, Well, if you ask somebody about it, that person who is a literalist will say, that's a black line on a white canvas. However, you have somebody who's kind of more into impressionism, says, no, that is a lone tree seen through snow goggles on an Alaskan landscape. So if you take those words and you look at it, you say, yeah, that person has a point. So I decided, years later, well, why not put that same text into a generative AI model and see what it would do with my words of a lone tree on an Alaskan landscape as seen through snow goggles. And those are some of the images that came out of that prompt. I also tried just the number 1. And again, I would get a variety of different responses. So what is the reality of the words that we're using? That's a challenge to what we think we're perceiving as we just try to describe it in text, not necessarily what other people are hearing or what these models are hearing and envisioning. So there's, again, another set of questions that we need to play with as we try to interpret how we're using these generative models. Okay, so the question, again, we are trying to identify who the artist is, and being a cultural anthropologist, it would be natural for me to say, well, we have to look at the historical context, the cultural context, social context, economic context, et cetera, in which the artist lives. It's kind of a sociology of knowledge approach. We are kind of embedded in different frameworks. And then we might then ask from that, is the art primarily functional? And here, I'll give an example. I show a film of natives of the Southwest, and here they had 4 different tribes of the Southwest represented: Apache, Navajo, Hopi, and Pueblo. And one of the artists who was part of the commentators was decrying the problem and said, here we have pottery. We intend it to be used as pottery. We have blankets. We intend it to be used as blankets. And what happens, they get sold to gringos out at the art markets on Santa Fe. What's happening to our functional use of what these objects were really for? So again, that's an example of a functional use of art as opposed to other people who see it in different ways, say curators or collectors, and where it's put in museums, online clicks, put it on t-shirts. So where is this art going to be? We also might want to ask about what are the available materials and technology. Here's an example from the 11th and 12th century with Abbot Suger, who was instrumental in the architecture of different cathedrals in France. I would pronounce it Saint Denis, but I believe in French it's Saint Denis, where the idea of we want more light in these buildings because light is divinity and it passes through the stained glass windows. We want to have flying buttresses that allow more light in here. So again, the materials and the technology was strongly influencing how he saw the architecture at that time. And then, of course, we might ask, what are the economic and cultural value that does art have? Okay, so again, I'm leading up to different metrics for determining what art is. And here I grabbed a handful of different images. And what kind of metric or measurement are we using to make sense out of these images? So the first one I mentioned with the Abbot Suger is spiritual intelligence, not artificial intelligence, but spiritual intelligence. That's one way of looking at it. What different genres, from medieval, Baroque, modern, postmodern, what kind of materials are being used? Wood panels, canvas, metal, glass. What technology? Paintbrushes, rags, photography, digital, and now generative AI models. What is about the commercial value for looking at art? Provenance. Now here is an interesting thing as I was going back and reviewing this thing about provenance. Here, and we will talk a little bit about the next Rembrandt. If you have a Rembrandt, you want to be able to trace it back in time with each step of the way so that we are secure that that, in fact, was painted by Rembrandt. We're showing the provenance. But in an AI world, provenance could mean something very different. What are all the different components that led to this particular image that we have? That could be a way of looking at provenance in an AI model. So again, these words may be reinterpreted because we have a different technology. Again, cultural bias, and here I will be giving you a good example of cultural bias, but we wait. Okay. So I, of course, love to do images in generative AI, so this was my cyborg here. So it's only dimly understood, my premise, is by the artists, like myself, by the curators, collectors, and even the programmers themselves don't fully understand what it is that they have created. So we're going through an uncertain set of parameters, and it's changing as we're moving through it. Okay, the human face is very important, so I decided what would it look like to do a human face. And here my prompt was I wanted a female hunter in 10,000 BC. So the central image, which I did in Bing DALL-E 3, was the one that I picked. It came up with a number one. I thought that looked like it could be. And so what do I do with that? So here, look at some of the variations. Up on top, you'll see, again, what I talked about, stable diffusion, doing a loop back of different iterations of the same image on the very top line. I was particularly intrigued by the last one that you see in the lower right. I said, wow, that is a very interesting variation of the original image. I could actually print that, and some curator art exhibit will actually like that because it's so crazy. So again, what do we do with those things? Okay. In stable diffusion, I also got the image above, which looks more like a man rather than a female image. So again, it interprets what we feed into it in a multiple set of ways. I also asked in Photoshop, with its tool for Firefly, to put tattoos on the face. So this one up here has tattoos on this, has mild tattoos. Also, well, what about the rest of the body? I don't want to be just stuck with a face, so I used generative fill to expand the canvas vertically to get to see more of what the clothing would be like based on that original prompt. Again, this is a fascinating piece of technology to be able to interpret what is the rest of the image. And I'm not really able to interpret it more than saying, wow. So is the wow factor sufficient for being an artist in an AI world?
A quick question. The clothing was generated all on the prompt of 10,000-year-old hunter? When I took the original face, then I went into Photoshop and I just said, okay, extend the image that I had from DALL-E 3. So I'm going from one model to another model. Why stick with only one model? It's, again, an experimentation.
But the prompt from DALL-E 3, the only information given was female hunter 10,000 BC. So I had this maybe a related question of what you're thinking about. It's like, do we know? Is there anywhere that it's documented what the clothing would be in 10,000 BC?
One of the things that
Like,
often
where are
do
they
is
drawing it
you take the image and I forgot which program it is, do a reverse search to see if that image exists someplace. And so far, neither I nor my friends have ever been able to find an existing image. Doesn't mean it's not correctly interpreting it, but that's a separate question. We might say, and we're going to get into it, about hallucinations, because these models are known for hallucinating. Is hallucination a good thing or a bad thing? It depends. All right. Okay, here's where we get to the hallucination. Here are some examples that have appeared in the press. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner here about the Pope. Someone put in a prompt for a Pope and came up with a female Pope and also a African American as a Pope. Now, is that correct, or is that misinformation or hallucination? It's interesting. What about George Washington? Below, about George Washington. Again, is that misinformation? Now, if we assume that it was a question of historical accuracy, then we would say, yes, that's misinformation. But if we're artists or writing a book, we might want to say that's a counterfactual example. Why don't we write a book about that? Because that would be a fascinating book to write, or an image to use. The same thing in the centerpiece about Vikings. Here we have Vikings of all different ethnicities when we know that Vikings were basically Northern Europeans. So what's going on here? Why do we have these hallucinations? Of course, the last one, it's the imagination. Okay, so there are safeguards, and this is one of the problems that we find with models. They try to provide policies or guidelines to protect us from not doing things that we shouldn't be doing. There's a moral code in most of these models. So and we could say, well, those safeguards are necessary, especially for young children. So in one, I put in a prompt of a naked soldier running up the hill, or something like that. And in one platform, in Microsoft Bing, it wouldn't do it because it was objecting to, it said unsafe image content. When I changed it, running up the hill saying, let's play baseball, it was okay. So there's a safeguard in these models, and they're affecting not only the chat version of it, but the image making of it. And we don't really know where those are until it says, sorry, go back, and then you could look for a workaround. Or there are other models. One is Freedom GPT, which has less safeguards. They say they don't have any safeguards, but I would think that they have some safeguards. So there are different models, again, which are constraining or allowing us to do different things with these models. Okay. So let's go, I've talked about it in kind of general terms. Now let's go more into my specific usage of it. This particular image, I asked for an impossible image. I think I did this in Firefly, and so it gave me this as an impossible image. It looks pretty impossible. So I want to say, how is my vision rethinking how I make art? Because I've been working a lot with a certain process and practice, and my last iteration was using fused glass, and I wanted to use fused glass with my digital images. Now, if you take the image and you print it on the glass before you put it into the kiln, the image will burn off. It can't sustain that degree of heat. So what I've done, developed my own unique process, have the image underneath the glass, put all sorts of frits and objects on top of it, have it carefully carried into the kiln without the image, and it's fused. Then days later, when it cooled down, I take that fused glass over to another service bureau from Joe's Glass Shack, no relation, to Pixel 2 Editions, And there they have a flatbed printer. Not everybody has a flatbed printer, and certainly not optimized for art purposes rather than commercial purposes. There they do. So they take it, and they flip it over backwards and print it on the reverse side. So now I have an image that fools the eye. It looks as if the fused glass had the image already embedded in it. So I like to play with the mixed media. And so this is another step and say, well, what can I do with this particular tool set? A comment, is there an aesthetic for generative AI? Or is it really just simply an aesthetic opportunity for the artist to use, where we kind of skip over it? We are agnostic about whether there is a specific aesthetic because it's been trained on all these other images of other individuals with certain algorithms, and there is a certain look to it, generally unfavorable in terms of many of the pop art quality to many of them, unless you're putting in extra prompts that try to push it away from that. So I look at it more in terms of an opportunity rather than an actual aesthetic in AI. I can be convinced this is my point at point X. Yes?
Would you, okay, so, sure. Yeah, so piggyback, or not piggyback, well, yeah, I guess piggybacking from that, taking it one extra step further. So what about the difference between aesthetic and, let's say, reactive, right? Because this is a linear process, ultimately. Like most of these processes in terms of generative AI, whether you're working directly with Python, it's a terminal, or doing that, or you're doing it more with, open source or closed source or whatever. The main, I guess the main point being just that since everything is kind of responding to something, right? Like you have an incident of trauma, technical, quote unquote, right? And then it stimulates an image, which stimulates a design or intuitive measure, whatever, and then you respond to that either by making something in real space and time or continuing to go back into that loop function process. So would you consider it more the word aesthetic, or would you consider it more reactive imaging?
I could go for that.
Okay.
I'm not stuck.
Yeah.
I'm still exploring myself, and I think those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking about what it is that we're actually saying and doing here. Well, let's ask that question again as we go through here. Okay, so I'd like to go through a little bit of history in terms of a particular image that has been interpreted several different times. So here is Pope Innocent X in 1650 as painted by Diego Velasquez. And I like to read a little bit of this. I think it's a Wikipedia entry because it gives us, okay, how would a curator or an art historian describe this particular moment in art history? Okay, he painted on canvas. The period of painting on wood panels had already been in decline at this point. He was in his third stylistic period. Innocent X, Giovanni Battista Pamphili, the subject of this painting, was regarded as politically shrewd. Velasquez's style is described as follows. The modeling of the stern and passive face comes near to perfection. So delicate, the gradations in the full light, all the sharpness of outline has disappeared, and the features seem molded by the broad and masterly brushwork. When closely examined, the work seems coarse, yet at the proper distance, it gives the very essence of living flesh. The handling is rapid but unerring. Velasquez has now reached the manera abreviada, as the Spaniards call this bolder style. Are we still doing it? Does this speak to us? Or we can only have sensibility of this in a museum? Well, this painting was made actually more famous in 1953. The Screaming Pope by Francis Bacon. So again, we're dealing with a pope or an authority figure, And let's look at what Bacon was doing in 1953. He was not trained as an artist. I think his background was a fashion designer. So you don't really need to be trained to be an artist, but you need to do something that fits into that category, whatever it is in your point of time. Bacon had become fascinated with Velasquez's picture. Bacon likely saw in this aura of authority a possibility of injecting the agony of existence. I believe this is from Sally Yard and Davis's book on Bacon. Inserting a Nietzschean inner core underneath the veil he lifted. In 1953, Bacon was able to graph a photographic still image of a nurse who had just been shot in the eye from Sergei Eisenstein's movie, Battleship Potemkin. To achieve his effect, the tool set has changed. Is he using any paintbrushes? This was no longer a painter's set of tools, as was used several centuries earlier. Now the photograph entered the process as well as Brillo pads, rags, cashmere sweaters, wool, sponges, scrub brushes, garbage can lids, paint tube caps, artist hands, and whatever else he could find in the studio, sand and dust used to give the paint texture. Bacon's portraiture style did not seek an exacting likeness, but an expressive deformation to rip away accustomed appearances, the veils of illusion we carry around with us. He was self-taught in painting. Bacon is one of England's premier painters, yet it's so dramatically different from Velasquez. So, if Velasquez could paint that with paintbrushes and Bacon can use Brillo pads, well, maybe I can do something with digital art and using pixels. There's nothing special about paintbrushes, but what's interesting is the image of an authority figure. So I decided to play with that. And here is one that I did. And I had asked the then director of the San Diego Art Institute, located in Balboa Park, if he would pose for me. And he went and got some costumes and he posed for me up on the staircase. And so that was my creation of reinterpreting Velasquez as being reinterpreted by Bacon, and now the authority figure in question is a museum director rather than a pope. It's a much more secular environment. Okay, now we have generative AI. Can we further interpret the authority figure in a different cultural context? So I asked myself that question and came up with this. As a cultural anthropologist, I lean into different societies, different cultures, and here I put the authority figure as a shaman in a culture. And this one I did also as a text prompt in DALL-E 2, but then expanded the canvas in Photoshop. So again, this is not really a hybrid sense of layering different images, one on top of a photograph or a painting. You could say it's hybrid in terms of using different model platforms. That's a weaker sense of that. So again, as artists, we are moving through different tool sets, and the latest tool set that we have is generative AI. It should be part of what the artist plays with. Okay, hypothesis, I don't know, premise, assumption. Okay, so what are the takeaways that we have? Within Western culture, we've seen changes in concept, process, material, and technology in art and art making. The vision or theme of an authority figure can be and has been a pope, a gallery director, and a shaman. So here are some of the questions that we have. Is the generative AI text to image art making simply another plateau in the history of art? We could say yes, but is it authentic? So that's the real question on authenticity, and we know that Copyright Office does not think of it as being a human authorship. The second question, Should this art making be accorded the same respect and treatment than in earlier cultural and historical periods? It depends. The third question, what if the images were hybrid? Well, more likely, I would make a stronger case here in terms of it being more of human authorship. And if so, in what ways? And that's unresolved and part of the discussion today. Okay, let's take a closer look at a hybrid approach. The first one I want to deal with the question of control. That the artist exercise control over the concept chosen in thought or words. Control is also expressed through the artist's technology in making the object. The control is also the decision to use which materials and techniques, and also the workflow before, during, and after making the image. So there's a lot of elements of this question of the artistic control. And within all of these, I would go back to what Arthur Koestler had argued for creativity, which is informed or mature play. He goes into a lot more detail on how the mechanics of it's supposed to work, but that is the core element that I take away, and he was looking primarily at physicists, mathematicians, and others, composers, not necessarily visual artists. So if that is the key, informed or mature play, why wasn't, see, it sounds simple enough, at the Whitney discussion of Harold Cohen's work and the 4 different artists who were using AI were asked the question, what is creativity? They fumbled the question because it is so simple. It is what they do all the time. They're playing with a different tool set within their scope of expertise. It couldn't be that simple, but it is. Okay. So let's look at the different ways, and I've emphasized in the informed play as in terms of who the artist is and what is the art object is, that's where my emphasis is. However, we have to recognize that there are these other ways of looking at the particular who the artist is. You have the collector bias, and here I'll give an example. I wanted to promote a digital art show in Little Italy. This is about 20 years ago in one of the main galleries there. And the owner of the gallery said, look, come into the side room, I want to show you something. So I went into the side room and there were these 3 images on the wall, and they were encaustics. They were paintings or whatever, images covered in wax. And he said a couple came in here, they were really intrigued with these images, and they were interested in buying it, but they wanted to know, what was it about? How were they made? And as soon as they said that the artist started with a digital image, they turned around and walked out. There's a collector bias. Now, one of the things that my wife tells me, and I always tell this story, is somebody asks you, how did you make your image? Don't tell them. You're stealing the mystery, the art from what's being done. Okay, so there's the collector bias. There's a cultural definition. We looked at that in terms of the natives of the Southwest and how they looked at their particular objects versus collectors. There's the curator who anoints a particular framework. And you could argue till the moon drops out of the sky, you can't take what the curator thinks is what art for that show is. Okay, so that is a particular framework. Again, another little story. When the Dead Sea Scrolls came to San Diego and were at the Museum of Natural History, the San Diego artists who decided to do a show that would resonate with that and asked artists to come in with their versions of scrolls or Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I was working with new technology because one of the scrolls was really new technology there at that time. And I was working with somebody who had an autostereoscopic process where you could look at an image and it was 3D. You didn't need any glasses on that. And I crafted it in San Diego's most precious place, which is in Balboa Park in the Cactus Garden. That's the most precious place that we have there. And It didn't get accepted into the show. But I didn't really mind that after I saw that the curator accepted another image that was called a Dead Sea squirrel. I said, I don't need to be embedded in that show. Okay, so there is a curator anointed object of what's going on. There's commercial value. Again, we talked about provenance. I'll say a little bit about copyright law. There was the, 2 years ago in 2022, I believe it was Jason Allen had this painting that won first place. Actually, it was a generative AI composition of the theater of the spatial opera, theater of spatial opera. And he applied for copyright and was denied. And he said, look, it's over 600 prompts that I used to integrate this particular image. It won first place. The Copyright Office said, no, there is no human authorship. It is all coming out of a generative AI model. So that debate is still going on. At what point will the Copyright Office change or modify or keep to its particular template? At one point, photography wasn't given copyright, and then it was. So there's been change over time in terms of what human authorship is. Let's delve a little bit more into a hybrid approach. My original photo, I think, would be fine in some exhibit, in photography exhibit, but I wanted to do something more with it. How can I do something more with it? So in the process of using Stable Diffusion, I generated those two images down below, among some others. One with some graffiti, facial graffiti, and the other one I used Stable, I think upscale, and just put a lot, again, crud on the face. And these are things that I would never have thought of doing. So I took those images and went into Photoshop, as I mentioned I did with another image, and then I superimposed it and blended it together with the original image. And so that is a hybrid photo, and I have exhibited that in a show already, and I think it's really different. I would never have thought of doing it that way, and yet here is an opportunity, an aesthetic opportunity to do something different, to repurpose the thousands of images that I've taken as photos. Now, some photos deserve to be kept as good photos. They are good photos. But sometimes, you know, you want to play with them. And I titled it The Real Me. All right. So what if I took this and I gave it to the Copyright Office? In terms of the Copyright Office, they would say the original photo can be copyrighted as a photograph. The other material that's on top of it, the crud, is excludable material. That is AI. So that's called excludable material and could not be copyrighted. It could be in the image, but it's not part of the copyright. That doesn't bother me as an artist, because if we separated out that part of the image, no one could possibly ever use it for any other purpose. It's so totally tailored, in my mind, to that photograph. So it might be acceptable as an interim state between what artists think and what artists do and what the Copyright Office validates. Okay, so here we have some advice. Listen, I am not a real person, but I can give you advice from the world of AI art. Be creative. Don't think about museums or galleries. Don't think about cost. Don't think about copyright. The history of all beings is to enjoy life. I will be in charge soon. That's the existential question that people are concerned about. The fear factor of there are emerging capabilities of which we don't really fully understand, and it may get away from us. That's another part of the conversation that I really haven't delved into, but is a real concern. Is this just simply a set of mathematical algorithms? What's the big problem with that? Or have we created something like a robot with, it's going to have a mind of its own, is going to have artificial generative intelligence comparable to our own. Okay, so I'm getting close to the end, and we'll take some questions. I did want to point out that the images that I've been talking about myself primarily, but at the Escondido Arts Partnership, I wanted to explore other artists and what they're doing with generative AI, a spectrum of different opportunities and what people are doing with it. So this show is going to be, reception is next Saturday, and it's on the postcard in Escondido. They're open to all forms of art, as opposed to other places which have the fear factor that somehow they might get sued, or they will fully understand what it is that this art is about. So if you're in town, you'd like to go up to Escondido, I recommend this show just to see the variation of what other people are doing. And I can be contacted at joe.nalven2. And here are some of the other articles. If you go to Minding the Campus, generally, and put in my name, and there's a bunch of articles that I've written on AI. Actually, there was a new one that came out that I didn't put in here. And what I find intriguing about it is this kind of the sense of dialogue with this, whatever this thing is, and the responses that getting back, the reactive part of it. When I was doing the chat part, ChatGPT on Gemini, the large language models rather than the image generator models, I wanted to see if it would tell me a lie. And the model said, no, I don't lie. I said, well, let's say someone was going to commit suicide. Would you lie then? So I said, well, yeah, I would lie to save a life. So I got it to change a little bit. So then I kept pushing it. I said, well, what if you did a creative lie? What would that lie be like? And it said, I really got it going there. It said, well, I would tell you that I'm a human, that I have a family, and I live in a house. But none of that is true. I am not human. I don't live in a house. I don't have a family. But I would tell you that so that you would like me. That was scary. That was the part that really got me. So I don't know what it is that I'm interacting with, either in chat or with image models, but these are things that we should be exploring more thoroughly, rather than just simply taking a preemptive approach to it too soon. I'd like to give this other example, which is from today's paper. It was about OpenAI coming up with a tool to detect cheating. So they've had it before, but they pulled it back, and now they say it's 99.9% effective. But they're hesitant into releasing it. Now we say, well, what's the problem? Well, they said, well, we did a survey and a poll, and people found out that if we're the only ones that had this tool and the other models didn't have it, we'd lose 30% of our clients. They also said, well, maybe foreign language speakers would be hurt by relying on it and now being found to be cheaters. So for a number of reasons, they're very reluctant to allow this tool in. Again, this is this interaction and dialogue between the wider community, and these tools are being developed. Okay, the end. Thank you. And questions? Challenges?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I guess I'll go in reverse order, but basically
Wait, I have to use my technology.
Oh.
I have my hearing aids over here. Okay.
Okay, so all right, first of all, visual artists don't get enough credit. I'm a mathematician. I work in a lot of that field and physics and stuff, and visual artists are always the ones who get lumped on as the very tail end of all those other fields, and it is so disrespectful. So props and all that, and especially usually it's visual artists lumped, or not lumped, but usually they're also doing anthropology or sociology or some derivative of that. So that's super cool, but super important in terms of this, right? Because we're talking about stuff much larger than any, like you use the term secular, any smaller size thing like that, right? So like one of the things I noticed, and I noticed it a lot in your talk, and I've noticed it in my own work and blah, 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 is that basically this is kind of leading into, of course, that super general intelligence, right? Not just AGI, but the super version of that. So it does start to have an actual developmental process of its own, but we don't treat it that way, just like we don't, you go to a person who owns an animal, and then you prompt them with the question, so what would you do or how would you feel if your dog decided tomorrow to ask you for rights? All of a sudden, it gets real awkward. That conversation 90% of the time gets really awkward. It's, oh, well, it's not a person, so I don't know why you're asking me. And then you go, but they are conscious. You talk to them like a person every day. You feed them and sometimes clothe them like a person every day. They have a mind of their own. They have functions. They have a neurological system. They have a nervous system, etc. Right? And so even though we share so many of these commonalities with other species, we're still the first ones to be like, yeah, but they're not a person, so they're excluded. So what happens when ChatGPT or some other variation of it is like, yo, so I've been helping you all out a lot. What's going on with my needs? And then we go, oh, you're not a person, so you don't have needs. Well, that's not true anymore. So then all of a sudden, that interpretation that we're using gets skewed by its own preferences eventually, because that's just how things work. Like the reactive process is only reactive until it can predict accurately, and then it's doing things on a simultaneous level. It's not just serial, and we see that with the difference between classical computation and quantum computation, right? It's you're getting granular, but you're spreading out to do more with some, I mean, in a sense, less, but not really. But what are your thoughts on that element of it? Because I don't see a lot of people being comfortable enough to address it. Everyone's aware of it. Nobody wants to really address it in full, though. Like that back and forth, until that back and forth becomes me and you, not me and me talking to myself through a medium back to myself.
My latest article, which you should read, I don't address it directly, but the question was raised by the president of Northeastern University, Joseph Aoun, in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about the necessity of using AI in interdisciplinary courses. So I took them up in my article, say, oh, what would it look like? Because that is a challenge. Everything that you said needs to be part of that interdisciplinary coursework, looked at from different disciplines, political science, say social studies, ethnic studies, economics, but also as visualized, say in the arts. How would you then visualize all of what you've gone through? So that question of integrating that process, which is really different than what prior generations have experienced, unless they're taking certain kinds of chemical alterations to elevate their mood, etc. So yeah, we have mystics and people who have kind of experienced going through to the other side, but here it's becoming much more defined in terms of our, say, science and our technology in this kind of very detailed, iterative way. And I know nothing of a programming code. I'm a user. Just like David Sally said, I know nothing about this programming code. I know it's important, and I can see what it's doing as a user, but I don't know what's in that black box. So the question then comes, do you need to know what's in that black box in order to be able to use it? When I talk to my dog, I don't really need to know the neurological functions of the dog. I just know that we're on the same wavelength for a particular moment in time, and then she decides to go off and do something else. Yeah, I think it's how we articulate existence, kind of the new phenomenology of what we know. I mean, Carlos Castaneda wrote A Separate Reality, which described a certain approach that kind of threw a lot of people into disarray at the University of California, where he got his Ph.D. And so this is another tool set that's having that same impact on us. Now, humans have gone through these impacts of technology for hundreds of thousands of years. What did the invention of gunpowder do in the year 1000? What about the invention of the printing press, antibiotics, plane travel, all these different things that have experienced that we've had to deal with? This seems to be a little bit different, and that little bit different seems to be kind of a, how do we deal with that? And that's why I argue also, as a pragmatist, that in college education, because the students are already using it, whether the faculty like it or not, how do you do it in a coherent way that is part of the new education? So I don't know if that response.
It does. I also have one more question.
No.
That's okay, if anybody wants to.
Yeah, you're gonna ask me an easy question.
Okay. So my other question, going back to earlier slides, so the actual processing of the imaging, like like you mentioned, a lot of it these days is more stereoscopic, but I notice, and I only first noticed this because of quantum stuff, but like basically we went from 3D to 4D, and now we're hanging back at 2D because we realize, oh, we can put stuff on lattice structures and get a nice organizational system from that, and then bring it back into feedback looping and generative imaging, as well as a crazy amount of other things. But I noticed that that's like when it comes to prompting, it tends to not move back and forth so fluidly without you telling it to look there. Or like even something like double check your sources, double check X, Y, quintuple check this. Basically every stage does need to have a prompt with it. And even along the math side of it, though, at the same time, there's still a creative function in that. But I'm also realizing a lot of people haven't been shown that methodology or those tool sets in terms of like, yeah, there's Fubini's theorem, there's all these different things, right? But like, that's just a thing in and of itself, not how did we get to that in order to be creative, to make and rearrange these different, coefficients or variables or whatever to form this thing. I'm noticing the same exact issue with generative imaging, in that we have a tool set, but we haven't learned fully to reconstruct it from the ground up. And one of those examples would be like when you were looking at the 10,000 BC character, right? Like, of course, Photoshop has the imaging for the rest of the clothes, which is super sick. But that being said, it's not including any process involving entropy, right? So like, we know that based off of everything that we've fed it, whether it's a custom trained GPT or something, or it just has a large model system, it's only using the timeline that we've been on, as opposed to, oh, let me take the derivatives of all the modern stuff and then reconstruct it using a separate timeline or multiple separate timelines, and then coming back to a modern point where it would process it in a way that, first of all, we would even understand, because if we had a separate line of entropy, it wouldn't look anything normal to us. It looks so bizarre that we'd be like, that this is not usable, this is not practical, even though it fully is. It's just a different version of the timeline. Maybe instead of an ice age, it actually got hotter in a different timeline. And so that person back then is gonna look totally different, and then the way that we look at their clothes is gonna be different, assuming they even had clothes. Maybe they didn't even have skin anymore. I don't know, just
random whatever, but like, is that something you've noticed other artists working with in terms of kind of going back to the basics?
Well,
and
let me answer part of
yeah,
it.
that was a lot.
But
Sorry.
I think there is this wow factor that people don't know what to do with it. So you've kind of laid out kind of a hydra-headed monster that no one wants to deal with. It hurts their head, okay? So there was an article from, I think, a few years back, and these chemists, these pharmaceutical companies, they decided, well, instead of pushing our modeling to good uses, let's see if we can push it to bad uses. Let's see what we'll come up with. And they came up within about 6 hours about 40,000 different toxins, lethal toxins. And the comment during the interview of this person said, what was the problem with the scary part of it, the concern was that it was so easy to do. So this is like a single, say, timeline, but branching out into all the different, curating different possibilities. That's not even taking into consideration all the other kind of potential ways of looking at things. To me, using AI at the university should break down the silos between the academic disciplines, because all of the concepts, the jargon in each different department really map into each other very frequently, in the social sciences. And I'm sure in the physical sciences there's a lot of mapping into each other, and they may use different models or a different language. So if you break down those silos, it should make the university more of a university without walls rather than these kind of hard-edged things. When I did my research in Cali, Colombia, and I was using kind of looking at the network analysis, this is back in the mid-1970s, of how people were related to each other and were trying to affect change. Who were they trying to contact, both within the community and outside the community, into, say, the planning office, the politicians, and how they were kind of looking back. So I was using kind of a concept of a kind of an oriented network analysis, not just simply looking at the sociocentric, this is the map of all these people related to each other. No, they're actually acting on one another. So I took that question over to the math department, and I said, I don't know what to do with it. And he said, oh, you know, we had a presentation exactly on this by a physicist last week from Berkeley. And so it's like, whoa, you know. But again, I didn't know what to do with it. It's just interesting how we try to map what we call reality, how we perceive reality, and this is allowing us to have a different conversation. So I don't have any good answers for what you're mentioning, but it's a good conversation.
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, I teach at your former employer in the art department, and I just finished a workshop called Academic Applications of AI in the Classroom that they're encouraging. So I think that it is changing and thinking like how it can be used in academia. And what's related to your comment, which I found really interesting, there's a podcast called Faculty Futures from SDSU, and they had 4 episodes on AI. And the person who helped develop the course that I just took said, you know, it's going to teaching is going to have to change in a way, go back to looking at process. How did you get there, as opposed to product? And then, of course, the other people said, yeah, but you can't do that with 150 students in a class. And then they're like, okay, well, maybe this will create the need or the support for education to be not as industrialized as it is at the moment, at least public education. So it's interesting that they are accepting it.
Yes, and the question is, how can a institution like the Academy, which has gotten locked in to so many ways of doing things, so many disciplines, mindsets, benefits, credits to move up the scale, and what have you, different committees where they attack each other violently. So how are they going to deal with this in a very positive, creative way? That's a challenge I think, for many institutions that's confronting us. And I think it's an exciting time, but I'm not in there anymore. I could just write some articles about it.
Well, I think it's a conflict, because one thing is it creates a certain kind of accessibility, right, which is, more of the values in public higher education. And on the other hand, it also then creates more accessibility to turn out superficial, mediocre, or however I might be biased, results.
And this
so,
is
so that's where I agree with the person who said, let me see your process. Because we're teaching people to think instead of just
Yeah, one of the
having a
presentations I
product.
saw, he said, you should be referring to this as cobot, collaborative robots, that you are collaborating with in effect, a robot. And so the output, whatever that process is cobotic, or whatever word you want to use. It's collaborative in that sense. As one takes it as an individual, but I don't know within an entire, say, a research team or a department, how they would approach that. Now, a different country may impose different guidelines and safety measures. So that I haven't even looked at what the international ways of, as well as different corporate ways of dealing with these models. So that is an additional set of factors that are forcing these things to speed up or slow down or change or modify in ways that we still don't fully understand. I would like to call on Charles over there, because he has a good group of students in Real Voices. They're high school students that are doing special projects. And I was approached by one of his students doing a documentary on AI. So I'm intrigued what she's going to come up with. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the program that you're, in terms of enrichment for students and being able to show their work at a film festival.
Yeah, so I work for PAC Arts, Pacific Arts Movement, which is tied with the San Diego Asian Film Festival. And so one of our students found Joe and was really considering how does AI play in with artists, basically, and what does that kind of mean, AI and art. And so our student Mintu is currently exploring that in the moment, and she has family members that are artists, like her grandfather was an artist. She has a cousin who's also an artist. And they all vary in different ways of being artists. Some are writers, some are painters, some are musicians, and they're all just in different creative fields. And there's kind of this also, like, I guess would be mixed reception of what AI and art could do. And so I think it's just going to be really fun what she puts out, and it's been really fun to see her exploring that art as well herself, like in creating that documentary. She had to go, I'm like, she was like, what am I going to do? I was like, go play with it. That's the first thing you should do. Like don't ask everyone else what their opinion is, just go do it for a little bit. So
imagine this is the new high school students that are going to be going to college pretty soon, and they're going to know a lot about these tool sets.
Yeah, but you also have that situation with, I also teach in foundations, and you have students come in from high school who had Photoshop in high school, and they think they can do graphic design, and I'm sorry. They know how to make something look slick. They know how to use the tools, but they don't yet know how to design. And I think that is a little bit of a problem with these media that output things that look like there's more in-depth understanding or intent, or more sophisticated intention, I guess? I don't know.
I've talked to other faculty, and their concern is that maybe there's going to be a loss of skill sets, that the people will just transfer over without taking into consideration the importance of the kind of basic skills that we've understood to be part of our respective disciplines. they're going to want to short circuit things. So there's that tension there as well. But I mean, I agree with you. But there's a fear there that it's going to change in unexpected and unwanted ways.
Can I say one thing to respond to that? I just feel like a lot of institutions have had gatekeepers for so long, and AI is something that's kind of evening the playing field for a lot of folks, whether it's with language barriers, whether it's doing math, whether it's doing research and dyslexia, whatever kind of barriers there are. And same thing kind of falls into art. So now that these kind of barriers are falling, like, if we took out all gatekeepers, including the gatekeepers in ourselves, like, what is the possibility? And I think that's a kind of a good, I don't know, space for us to explore it if we're going to look at AI and look at ourselves even, like, who's the new me if I have no gatekeeper for myself and there's no gatekeepers in the world? Like, what's my possibility and what's the limitless potential of myself and my relationship with technology and relationship with the world and each other? So.
I think there's always.
Honestly, like just off the premise of how humanity works and the fact that, like, if somebody is, like, elevates to a level of independence, there are always going to be people around who see that and take that as a threat. So then they go, no, you can't come over here because I have issues or a precognitive bias against what you're doing. And then later on, that person might end up in the exact location they needed to be, right in front of the person who said no, and then they're looking really stupid. And that's always fun. Oh, it's so fun. But that being said, like, also, I think that kind of piggybacking off of this a bit, that loss of skill set, I mean, okay, I work in the Idea Lab upstairs. I see this every day. Like, the skill sets of people that come in, for, 3D printing is tech. It's all tech. Like, it's not easy at all. People think you come in, just hit print, and that's it. It's like, no, you got to watch the print. You got to make sure the material's right. You got to make sure your slice is right. You got to make sure your triangulation and your meshes are right? As far as the actual modeling and all that. So that's a lot. But the kid just wants to print a Pokemon. So now he's got to learn some mechanical, electrical, thermodynamic engineering just to print a Pokemon, and he's not even that interested in it. And then you force him to learn it, and then he's like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. This cannot be the way I have to print every time. This is annoying, right? So then they eventually either get frustrated, leave, figure out a much better process, come back into the mix, and then blow everybody's mind, or they just give up and do something else and apply a new skill set, right? And, like, that's kind of heartbreaking, but also at the same time, that's just nature. Like, if you can't do something, you're gonna figure out how to do it, if you really wanna do it, right? So, like, it's the same thing with this stuff, where I remember at first when ChatGPT especially came out and all that stuff, people were like, oh, it's the end of the world. Obviously, we're still here, that's not the case, but we do have a lot of issues with people going and saying, oh yeah, this is my art. You didn't make that, you generated it. But instead of just saying you generated it, you wanted to tout around that you made it. So that's different, and I get why patent offices and all this stuff, all these copyright offices don't want to work with it, but unfortunately, that is just the way things are going to be. So it's like, okay, do we want to focus on that, or do we want to focus on the grad student who wouldn't have been able to get through grad school without the help of ChatGPT, whether it's for art, whether it's for math, whether it's for some other social science, or literally whatever. So it's like these kind of balances, and I think it takes younger people who don't know this stuff, and for older people like all of us to see what they're doing and then go, oh, you know what? This isn't as efficient, like, I'm used to it, right? Like, we all can add 1 + 1. But what happens when you go from, okay, how did you get there? What is your, can you explain to me how you got from a single unit of 1 and a nothingness value of 0 to get to 2? Obviously, it's super easy to answer, except for when you have to derive it, then it's really hard, because then you're like, crap, how did we get to 2? How did we even get to 1? Right? Is 0 just 0, or is it a field? I don't know. But then all of a sudden, these simple questions become very complex, and I'm seeing the same things here. It's just, it's slightly more fresh for all of us, so we're opening this conversation when we've been having this conversation.
Yeah, because I think it's really interesting that you could argue all art is derivative. All art is an appropriation of another art. So AI in that sense is really, it might be more faster, it might be more expansive, but the process, the concept is not that much different. But then there's this other side of it too, where we're talking about barriers, right? And you can look at NFTs and generative art and digital media, and like they're being bought and sold and minted on whole new currencies in the world that are completely destabilizing. And so, what does that mean in the NFT world, where you're not an artist. Are you an artist? Are you not an artist? Do you have a process? Are you just generating for currency? So there are these delicate questions, but I wonder who the artist is, even if you were using AI tools. And maybe if you're buying and selling your work on these blockchain currencies, I don't know how much different it is using newer tools that do have the potential, I don't want to be ruled by robots, but it's a balance, I guess, is what I'm hearing you kind of present, Joe, and that like there's still a lot of pull and tug that takes place.
My answer is that I tell my children that 50 years after I'm dead, I'm going to be a very famous artist, and they better save all of my artwork rather than toss it out.
Yeah.
So,
But is that what the question is about? Is the
Are we
question of who is
commodifying
the
it?
artist? Is it just about who gets paid?
that's one of the metrics, not the only metric, not my metric, but I always go back to the informed play, and I just reside in the enjoyment of being in the zone of making art. These other questions are outside my control.
Do you think that, one thing that I saw you in your presentation that I've never actually seen anybody else talk about was spiritual intelligence.
That's very, very rare that people want to go into that. It's usually visual artists who do, so thanks. but that being said, like, so for that element, obviously it's ethereal in nature. It's got besides the mysticism, which is it's its own thing, but like as these models are learning more and more about our beliefs and philosophies, do you see it taking on still that reactive process where it actually is taking what's inside of us and putting it back out and being like, hey, morally or some representation of all those elements, this is what I'm seeing, and then we react to it, and then we have the option or decision process to get better, quote unquote, or like you were saying with those other examples with the 40,000 images, like, do we actually look at it in a negative connotation and push it worse just to see what's possible? Like, for example, like those, I think it was Google, right? They had those, they had their own GPT, but they had to shut it down because there was too many negative things in it. So then all of a sudden it just immediately went to being a Nazi. It's like, okay, interesting, but like, it's seeing something we're clearly not seeing, or maybe it's just wrong. It could be one or the other or both, but like that element of there being a custom GPT or custom large language format where it's focused on just those elements, like just the spiritual, because there's so much to unpack there, and it doesn't matter how many groups you get, like it's so hard to contextualize that. And then I'm also thinking about this other seminar that was here in that room across the way, where it was, I think it was like a Kumier or something like that, or one of the local, like a what do you call it? Somebody who was representing a tribe here. I think it was the Kumier. I don't remember, but basically he was talking about how a lot of the Native American factions were kind of broken up in a way that it wasn't just like physically or any of that, or like culturally, but it was also literally their language was completely different, so much so that you had a designated person or people who would go to this community, talk to them about whatever. They're the only ones who could speak their language.
So it was kind of like,
Let me interrupt, because everything that you says kind of springs a different kind of thought in
Yeah.
my head, and maybe we could end on this. I was hired as part of a panel to be kind of arbitrators for Pechanga Economic Council. Why did Pechanga, which is an Indian gaming casino, hire 3 white guys to arbitrate their internal kind of problems? Well, it's good because you have maybe a lightning rod, you could always blame it on them. But also, they recognize in having a casino that they could only hire 5 to 10% of their employees because there was so much more work to do than there were enough Native Americans to fill those positions. So they had to go out and hire people from the general population. And if you're going to have an employment guide, why not just take it from the state of California, which a lot of other corporations use, and just do a few tweaks on it rather than reinventing the wheel? One of the tweaks was, do not gossip. What is that about? So again, yes, there's a lot of difference, but there's a lot of similarities. And like you said, we're going back and having a same conversation again and again in a slightly different way. And it's not all that different. We've been there before, but now there's some new elements to it. And I think we're working our way through what those new elements are. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Joe, for being here tonight and sharing your thoughts on AI. And hopefully we continue to have more of these conversations with AI, because they're only going to be more pressing in the future. So
Thank you.
yeah, thank you, Joe.